Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Sergio, and I am the handler for Mayday's Delta Green campaign, Doomed to Repeat. And with me again is the longest-serving vessel of the Dischorder, Black Project Gaming's Vince. What's up, buddy?
Hey man, good to be here, and of course glad to have you all tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, please consider liking and subscribing to us on whatever platform you happen to enjoy us on. Reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify helps boost our visibility significantly and helps us continue to grow. If you want to help us out further, there's our Patreon, where you can find extended versions of these very episodes as Patreon exclusives, along with my playthrough of God's Teeth with the Black Project Gaming role players.
Everyone, May is AAPI Heritage Month, a celebration of our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. This month, Mayday is raising funds for the West Maui community of Lahaina. On August 8th of last year, a wildfire decimated homes, businesses, and cultural sites, claiming the lives of 100 people and leaving thousands without homes. We hope to raise funds to support a community on the rebuild, as many still lack dignified housing or critical support. So if you are willing and able to contribute, please visit our Ko-fi, where all proceeds for the month of May will go directly to the fund. And we have a link in our description below. So now, with the business out of the way, let's get to it and access this month's Dead Drop. Vince, last month we released our final Impossible Landscapes walkthrough, and we have the rest of the year to talk about all the other incredible Delta Green content. This month we're going to catch up on some Delta Green news, and we will discuss investigative protocols that help you be a better player at the table. It's a rare player-centric topic for us.
And for our scenario discussion portion, we're actually going to be talking to Eric Prister of the Nature of My Game podcast, who recently completed a run-through of puppet shows and shadow plays. We're going to find out directly from him what he thought of the scenario and how best to run it.
Okay, well, let's first discuss some Delta Green news, as it's been a couple of months since we've had an update. First of all, there is a lot of content coming from Arc Dream. The first is some source books, Operational History, which is a kind of deep dive on the history of the fictionalized Delta Green from its inception to the modern world, filled with operations, NPCs, handouts, artifacts, threats, and more. There's also going to be a book that we discussed with Dennis Detwiller in our last interview with him about Pisces. And there's also a book called Deep State. Pisces covers the British organization that investigates the unnatural. Adam Scott Glancy is nearing the end of revisions with a first draft by Giles Hill, and Deep State is also in the works. Those Who Come After is another source book detailing the extratemporal machinations of the so-called Great Race of Yith, and that will include an updated campaign of Future Perfect with all new art by Dennis. So I feel like the end of this year is going to be looking very different from the beginning of this year in terms of Delta Green content that's coming.
Yeah, it's gonna be a great end of the year. I can't wait for some of these materials. I mean, Deep State is going to be incredible. I'm super excited for that. But speaking of campaigns, we've got Falling Towers on the way, still in the works. Obviously, no release date officially announced. We all know and love Arc Dream's policy of it's ready when it's ready. This is one of the original campaigns that was announced back with the original Delta Green Kickstarter. It's going to be set in 2003 New York City. It's going to involve the newly activated program, and it's going to be going after the Fate directly. And of course, everyone's favorite avatar of Nyarlathotep, allegedly, Stephen Alziz.
I like this because, we've gotten scenarios like Dead Letter, which we'll talk about in a minute, that kind of talks about, Delta Green mopping up those last of the Nazi forces. And here's a more modern setting using the program, using a little bit of lore about Delta Green in 2003 when they're taking out the Fate and the end of them.
That's going to be a doozy. Yeah, I'm excited for that.
There's a couple products coming out or are already out that are worth mentioning. The King in Yellow Tarot deck was released in April. This is a great supplemental product that can be used with the Impossible Landscapes campaign, and you can buy it in print and PDF format at shop.arcdream.com. The scenario Meridian is out finally. Also out is God's Teeth Evidence Kit. Maybe that's something that you want to get for your game, Vince.
Oh yeah, already got it, already using it, baby.
What comes with it? What does it look like inside?
Bunch of different handouts available for the campaign that, like, for example, one of the initial ones, once you crack it open, is the poster of the little girl with the white teeth and the pizza with meat written over it that you can see as you walk into the gas station. One of those first synchronicity events is now a full colored, fully produced handout, which is awesome. Really helps set the tone and the atmosphere for that first scenario.
Yeah, hopefully it sells well, and then they'll do what Dennis was hoping, which maybe they do one of these for Impossible Landscapes and some of the bigger campaigns.
Absolutely.
Speaking that we mentioned earlier, Dead Letter is coming out this month. It is out for review on Dennis's Patreon, so you can read it there and help out with the editing of it. It will eventually be gathered in the collection Delta Green Incursions, so it sounds like they're going to create another control group, Night at the Opera type of collection of scenarios, and it'll be part of that.
Let me tell you, if you want to see early versions of these scenarios, of these campaigns, and kind of have a hand in helping review them, provide feedback, or really just getting your hands on them before anybody else, you've got to join Dennis's Patreon. It is, the value for the money that you spend is absolutely freaking astronomical. I can't plug it enough. Onto virtual tabletop news. For Foundry, we have Need to Know now. We've got the Agent's Handbook. We've got scenarios like Convergence, Puppet Shows and Shadow Plays, Jack Frost, Operation Fulminate, and coming soon, I believe, is Reverberations for both Foundry and Roll20. So Arc Dream is really pushing hard into this virtual tabletop integration, which is absolutely awesome to see.
This is so great. It's so nice to see that Arc Dream is really trying to support the VTT workspace, because it just makes the game more accessible, and it's so much less prep time for handlers. So much of our time is often spent producing handouts and things like that, and now we've got it in Foundry form, so that's great.
Absolutely.
Slightly out of the normal news, but worth mentioning, if you are a creator of Delta Green content, Rachel Ivey has created a Discord where content creators can assemble, talk shop, share resources, and even find ways to collaborate. Vince and I are both on it, and our discussion later with Eric from Nature of My Game was born from this collaboration. You can also have your content publicized on the Delta Green website and through their socials by submitting to the Arc Dream Publishing promotional portal, which we will include a link in our description below. Make sure to reach out to Rachel, join the Discord, and fill out that promotional portal because it is a great way for your content to get seen.
Now, moving on to Arc Dream related news, not necessarily related to Delta Green or Delta Green content, but equally exciting.
Yeah.
Arc Dream has secured the rights from Glenn Cook himself to publish a role-playing game based on The Black Company, one of the very early examples of grimdark military fantasy around the eponymous mercenary company. It's going to be great. I'm so excited for that. And listen, if anybody can do dark anything, it's Arc Dream. So their take on this is going to be absolutely stellar. I've not even one iota of doubt that they're gonna knock this out of the park. It's gonna be a great product.
Did you ever read any of the books, The Black Company?
I did. Yeah, I did. They're great. Yeah.
I haven't read them. I was introduced to The Black Company through Matt Colville, watching his streams. He has the Chain of Acheron, and that was an obvious inspiration from The Black Company. So I'm excited for it as well. I love the idea of regular soldiers in a mercenary company, but it's set in a very high fantasy or fantasy setting. So it's going to be a lot of fun to see how they produce this.
It's muddy, it's bloody, it's gritty, it's dark. It's going to be so good. I am very, very excited for that.
Yeah, so we'll stay tuned and we'll see what the latest developments are when it comes to this. Although I'm sure it's probably a few years away.
Probably.
So that's all the news for now. Let's move on to an advice segment that is more player focused, but I do think that handlers could get some helpful advice out of when designing their own homebrewed scenarios. One area that we see a lot of players ask questions about is how to conduct an investigation and what tools they can use to further their inquiries. I think this is very common for a lot of players because they are not in law enforcement. It's funny because in the Delta Green community, there are certainly lots of folks who come from law enforcement or from the military, so they have an idea. but a lot of folks who love Delta Green have no idea how law enforcement works. So we're going to talk about it today.
Yeah, the intent really with this segment is to lay a foundation, right? It's to provide some very basic, very foundational starting points, ideas for players to conduct that initial response, to start their investigation off right. And then if need be, if they're already knee deep in an investigation and it's going nowhere and they don't know what to do next and they're stuck, going over some of these very basic, very foundational principles could help them kind of hit that reset button and, develop those leads that maybe they missed or find new avenues of investigation to keep things moving forward.
As a preface to our conversation today, everything that we are discussing can be found very easily doing enough research or a Google search. And fortunately, Vince has some real-world experience with this that we are building off of.
Yeah, I've been fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on how you look at it, to have worked in and around the military, law enforcement, security apparatus for the past 20 years. So it's really just taking some of that experience and helping you build a better game as a handler and portray a better character, a better agent as a player.
Today, while we're discussing this, we're going to be using a document that Vince has actually put together called Investigations 101. It's still in a draft phase, and we're hoping to have this put together and posted on our Patreon, along with a link in the description. Probably not going to be out upon our initial release, but we will have it out eventually. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the initial response, which is usually what I think players interact with the most. It's usually at the beginning of a scenario, you have that initial response, but let's talk a little bit about that.
The example I'll kind of use in this case is we'll take that initial scene from Viscid, where you show up to the doctor's house to walk through the crime scene to assess where the bodies fell. This is really where you're going to get your investigation started off right. The thing to keep in mind with Delta Green as agents, you are not first responders, which means you are not going to be the first ones at the scene of a crime, an incident, an incursion, whatever. Because of that, the initial forensic examination of the scene, the collection of evidence, likely has already been conducted by the time you've got there. What that means is that you are going to have to play nice with the local responding agency. So first things first, who is the responding agency? Are they, in most cases, your case officer is probably going to have provided you with that information. But if not, all it takes is a quick Google search to find which law enforcement organization is going to cover a given town or a county. Now, for those who may not know how law enforcement typically works, if it's an incorporated community, so your typical town or city, it's going to have a local police department. If the town or city is unincorporated, it's going to be serviced by a county sheriff's office, right, which covers the entire county.
County sheriff versus local police. Do the police not have sheriffs? Sheriffs are a completely different department. Can you explain the difference between those two?
Yeah, so local police are led by typically a police chief who is appointed. Sheriffs cover a county and are elected, and they may not even necessarily come from within the department. Are from the sheriff's department or the sheriff's office. In some cases, they are running for office. They run for elections. They have to campaign like any other political nominee, and it is a very political position. Now, what's interesting, not to get on too much of a tangent, but when you're dealing with sovereign citizens, so in the United States, we have this thing called, the sovereign citizen movement, where these individuals believe they are quote unquote sovereign and do not have to adhere to United States law. They will often recognize the authority of a sheriff versus a police chief because the sheriff is elected by the people. Just a little gee whiz piece for you there.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. I mean, I always see those videos online. So if they come across a sheriff, maybe they'd act a little differently.
Yeah, but when interacting with sheriff's deputies, they tend to be a little bit more well-behaved because they view them as elected.
And there is also the highway or interstate police that are a little different as well.
Oh yeah, to make this even more complicated, when we're dealing with highways or interstates, right, that are not necessarily in a given community, whether incorporated or unincorporated, it's going to be state police that have jurisdiction over that, or highway patrol, which every state has a different, a different aspect of that. Usually, however, state police investigators can be brought in to assist police departments or sheriff's offices in more complex investigations. If you want to see a good example of that, True Detective Season 1, where Russ Cole and Marty are brought in as Louisiana State Police investigators to assist local county sheriffs with their investigation.
I see.
Yep.
So once you have identified who is in charge, what are some things we can talk about with them and get from them?
Yeah, so first things first, you're going to want to talk to 4 groups of people. It's going to be the first law enforcement officers on the scene, so who initially showed up and who initially secured the scene. Then you're going to want to talk to the responding investigators, because typically what will happen is once the scene is secured, somebody's going to call up back to dispatch, back to the detective bureau. They're going to request assistance, and somebody's going to be sent out. Then you're going to want to talk to whoever processed the scene, which is going to depend on how big the department is, right? It's either going to be the responding investigators themselves, or in cities with large departments, they may have a separate crime scene investigation unit. We can talk to them as well. And if we're dealing with dead bodies, the coroner or the medical examiner is going to be that fourth party you're going to want to talk to.
Gotcha. So there's the initial folks that show up, the usually police officers. There's the investigators, the detectives that are assigned to it. There is the crime scene investigation unit. These are the folks that are more focused on like the blood spattering, the evidence collection, those kinds of folks. And then there's the coroner. That's what you're saying?
Yep. And when talking to these folks, all of your questions should really seek to answer those 5 W's and the 1 H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Really, anything else is superfluous and not necessary. All of your questions, no matter how they are phrased, no matter what you're asking about, they need to seek to answer those 6 questions. Who, what, where, when, why, how.
I think that's really a useful bit of advice for players, because I think sometimes players get really overwhelmed by, I'm not a cop, so I don't know how to think like a cop. Who, what, where, when, and why. Those are simple statements that I think everyone can universally latch onto and revolve their investigation around. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, it's really not rocket surgery. When you get down to it, a lot of it is dictated by common sense, believe it or not. Now, something else to consider is that there will be a variety of documents generated by the law enforcement response to and processing of the scene. You're going to want all of it, especially if you're talking about a cover-up scenario, right, where you're not necessarily conducting a legitimate investigation, you are actively covering it up. So this is going to include, but is definitely not limited to, the reports generated by the first law enforcement officers on scene. They're going to have to write a report. Your crime scene entry and exit logs, that's going to show you who came in and who left. Crime scene sketches, photographs, video recordings, because this day and age, crime scene documentation is huge. So it can be recreated for juries, and it can be shown to jury pools, and it really helps paint the picture in prosecution. So sketches, photographs, video recordings, you're going to have all 3. The investigators' reports, so your detectives, whatever reports they're generating, forensic reports for any evidence that's been gathered and analyzed, and then, of course, if an autopsy was conducted, the report that came out of that. At the end of the day, this is really going to come down to interpersonal skills. Flashing badges and swinging around the big federal genitalia is not going to get you anywhere. If anything, it's going to piss off local law enforcement, and it's going to bring the investigation to a very early conclusion.
As with all hierarchies, being nice to the top usually gets you a lot more than being rude. I think this is actually one of the first lessons that players new to Delta Green learn. Folks don't think about it. They come in, I'm an FBI agent, and they just start being jerks. And I've had to teach several players the lesson of you're not going to get much that way.
No. More flies with honey, right? That's you
Yes.
catch more flies with honey.
Yes. I like also that you list some useful skills that you can use in this section.
Yeah, and that's when we get the final document out, it's going to have all this. So some useful skills to solicit cooperation, bureaucracy, law, persuade, a general charisma check.
Yeah.
You can use criminology, search, or intelligence to identify items of interest in reporting. Use forensics and medicine to identify information of interest in the crime scene documentation and forensic analysis reports and the autopsy. You can even use pharmacy to detect or identify, poisons or illicit substances that were in, the decedent's system.
A skill that is not often used enough. So I like that you included pharmacy there. Once the agents have gotten to the scene, have been able to, start the investigation, there is our section about working the scene and what players can do to be effective in the crime scene. Could we talk about that?
I can summarize it really quickly. At the end of the day, start in, work out. As long as you remember that axiom, you're going to be fine. The thing to remember is that even though a crime scene, and even if it's already been processed by local law enforcement, it may help for you as Delta Green to do your own examination. Because remember, you may be looking for something that responding personnel had no reason to believe even existed. So you're coming in with a different perspective and a different mindset, so you may be able to identify and seize something that may have gone completely unnoticed. So again, remember, unless you've assumed federal jurisdiction for this investigation, you're gonna need local law enforcement permission to enter the crime scene. Unless, of course, you've got a good enough stealth rating and you can make the requisite roll. Go nuts, right?
Sometimes you got to go back to the scene of the crime. Sometimes you got to sneak into certain places. So yeah, you mentioned here sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Exactly, yeah. But at the end of the day, don't write any checks that your skill ratings can't cash. If you do get caught, you better have an excuse or a sufficiently believable cover story. But even then, you've got to be ready for blowback. It's coming. Yeah. The specifics of every investigation are going to differ, but the foundational principles are really the same. For example, let's take a death at a private residence, at a house. So we're going to start our examination in the room where the body was found. Then you're going to work your way out to the part of the house that the room was located in. Then you're going to search the remainder of the structure. And then once the interior has been thoroughly examined, you're going to check out the exterior, the yard, what we call the curtilage, which is legally defined as that immediate area surrounding a dwelling. Take notes of the residences or establishments behind, next to, and across the street from your scene, because especially in this day and age where we've got ubiquitous video surveillance everywhere, they're either going to be witnesses or they're going to have access to video footage that either needs to go away or may be useful in helping you kind of figure out what happened and where to go next.
And what are investigators looking for? I suppose obvious things like bullet holes and things like that, but what else should stand out to investigators?
So, I mean, from a legitimate investigative standpoint, right, bullet holes, blood spatter, you're looking to see exactly, again, you're answering those 5 W's and the H, right? How did this person die? What was the mechanism of death? What exactly happened for them to reach this state? But as Delta Green, you're going to be looking for, especially if there's an unnatural nexus to this whole thing, you're going to be looking for, signs of unnatural involvement. You're going to be looking for, if you're looking around and somebody died here and you find a pillar of salt in somebody's bathroom, like, okay, that's fucking weird. We've got a problem. Really anything and everything that may have been missed by law enforcement. Because again, at this point, it's already been processed more than likely. So you're not going to be the first ones at the scene. You're looking just to see anything that they missed that could either generate a lead to keep your investigation moving forward or something that needs to be covered up.
And you mentioned witnesses, so if there are neighboring houses, etc., it's not only important to speak to those witnesses or to identify who may have been able to have a good vantage point of the death or something like that, but also because if they saw something, they might be a potential vector as well that you'll have to deal with.
100%. Yeah, potential witnesses equal potential threats. So, as far as skills go, skills that could be useful in this, bureaucracy, criminology, law, persuade to gain access to the crime scene or to come up with a credible cover story. Again, listen, not all of our players are going to be silver-tongued devils, right? Yeah. So sometimes we've got to let the dice do the talking. These are the skills or the associated ratings that will do that. Gotcha. You can use criminology, forensics, and search to identify and recover evidence. And then when you're doing interviews, which we'll get into in a later section, human and persuade. At the end of the day, those two are going to make and break your ability to talk to people.
One of the less glamorous aspects of being an investigator is that you eventually have to look through files, read things, sit down and kind of do the actual hard work. What are ways that we can look at records and know what we should be looking for?
If it hasn't become obvious at this point, I may or may not have dabbled in some way, shape, or form in investigations. And let me tell you, the first thing that we may or may not have done upon receiving, an initial complaint or allegation, before we even do any of this other stuff, is we check records. We run records checks. Really conducting them is just a matter of having a sufficient rating in criminology or law or making a successful roll. It may be beneficial to know what kind of databases are available to you, but the way I would run it as a handler is if an agent or a player comes to me and says, I want to know this. It's like, okay, make your criminology and law roll, and then you get it. Because if your agents can think of it, there's a database for it. Full stop, guarantee it. Now, on the other hand, if you're trying to, the thing to keep in mind is with these databases, it requires a username and a password, and that creates an audit trail, right? So if you don't want to be caught using this and you don't want to be associated with that given name or address or whatever, you're going to need to use your computer science guy. So computer science or SIGINT really comes into play if you're trying to cover your tracks, if you're trying to hack into a database, or using false credentials to gain access to begin with. You've got the National Crime Information Center, which is NCIC, which is kind of the end all be all, right? It is criminal records that are, contributed to and accessible by criminal justice agencies all over the country. You can obtain everything from an individual criminal record to records that have been entered on stolen vehicles or stolen firearms. Then you've got NLITS, which is the National Law Enforcement Telecommunications System. I think it's now known as the International Justice and Public Safety Network. It's not for profit. It's privately managed. It's not a federal database, but it helps to consolidate, and link together every state, local, and federal law enforcement agency and public safety agency. Then you've got NDEX, the National Data Exchange, which is the FBI's version of NLITS. So again, we've got another redundant system that allows users to search records from local, state, tribal, and federal criminal justice systems. But then, on top of all that, then you've got your city, county, and state law enforcement records. So let's say a police department went out to somebody's house, but they didn't arrest anybody. It's what we call, what's been called a call to service or call for service. That's not going to get entered in an NCIC. That's not going to get entered in NLITS. That's going to be an internal, record or report. So sometimes, getting with those local law enforcement agencies and requesting those records nicely is gonna help kind of fill some of those gaps as well. That'll tell you if police have been to a property multiple times. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that helps kind of delineate the difference. If you just want to, if you need records, if you need information about a local situation, you might go to the local law enforcement. But unless there's a case, unless there's an investigation, you're not going to find it in the NCIC and the others. So let's get into databases and kind of public records. What kind of organizations are handling those?
You've got two that are LexisNexis Accurate and then Thomson Reuters Clear. They essentially just collate a bunch of public records information. It requires a subscription that typically an agency will pay for. Journalists use it. People looking for, bail bondsmen use it. Police use it. Investigative agencies use it. You can confirm an individual's address to include their past residences. So if you want to interview neighbors that maybe they had in the past, that would be a good avenue to develop those leads. This is a good avenue if you don't want to create as much of a quote unquote official paper trail. It's still a good avenue to develop leads without requiring access or law enforcement credentials to access a given database. And then you've also got TEX, which is another law enforcement database. It used to be called the Treasury Enforcement Communication System, but now we just call it TEX. It's Customs and Border Protection maintains it. It's essentially just identifying when somebody has flown out of and come back into the United States.
I see. So this is kind of the records of travel of individuals.
Right. And not the full picture, right? It's not going to tell you, every place they've gone into, especially once they're back in the United States. It's going to be mainly like, okay, did they fly out of LaGuardia and arrive in, Munich? And so it's just helping to build that international travel picture. And then you've got FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Reporting Network. So what that is essentially certain financial transactions that are considered suspicious, that are above a certain dollar amount, that generate, I believe they're currency transaction reports and suspicious activity reports. FinCEN is going to have records of those. So if you've got a lot of money moving around that is generating some attention, that's where you're going to be where you find those records. And last but not least, when it comes to military records, this comes up a lot. With military records, there is no centralized database. You're going to have to make phone calls. So it's really going to depend on the branch of service that you're looking into. So we'll take the Coast Guard, for example. If you want to get criminal records on someone that was in the Coast Guard and it was, investigated and handled within the Coast Guard, you're going to need to get a hold of the Coast Guard Investigative Service. For the Air and Space Force, that's going to be the Office of Special Investigations. For the Army, Criminal Investigations Division, and the Navy and the Marine Corps, it's going to be NCIS, which has its own TV show. Yeah,
so you're reaching out to the internal affairs departments to speak to them about these investigations. Gotcha.
Exactly. And that's where your bureaucracy and your persuade and all those relevant skills are going to come into play.
What are some useful skills? We've already mentioned some of them that you could use in this situation.
Criminology and law, just to make the check. Criminology to identify associations and patterns. That's just straight from the skill description in the book. Bureaucracy, law, persuade, or as mentioned, military science to obtain information from other agencies that you've got to call up. And then, of course, the ever-present computer science or SIGINT, or both, to gain that unauthorized access and cover your tracks.
Now, I think that players are most comfortable often with what we're going to talk about now, which is interviewing witnesses and associates of whoever it is they're investigating, etc., because this is just kind of a more natural thing to just talk to people, to ask questions, etc. But what are some things we should be thinking about as agents when we conduct these interviews?
When it comes to interviews, it is at one time both like the easiest avenue of information gathering, but also one of the most complicated, because you're not dealing with ones and zeros. You're not dealing with objective fact. You're dealing with people. And at the end of the day, people are the most unreliable form of evidence there is. Eyewitness testimony is not the make or break thing that everybody thinks it is, because people are fallible. Recollection is fallible.
That's worth pointing out too, because I feel like I've run investigations where players are like, this person admitted something, or this person said they saw something, and they just felt like they had found all the clues they needed to find, and in reality, it doesn't hold up in a court of law.
Nope, sure doesn't. Because you got to be able to, like, especially if you're going legitimate, if this is a legitimate investigation, you got to be able to prove this shit. And that includes false confessions, right? There have been instances where people have falsely confessed, due to mental illness or whatever other, motivation. And you can't put them away without stuff to back that up. When it comes to Delta Green, really the way to look at interviews is just a way of generating further investigative leads. It's not necessarily, you're not building a case, right? You're covering something up, or you're looking to do something off the books. But interviews are great for two main things, like I said, to develop those additional investigative avenues, but also to provide context, especially when you're interviewing subject matter experts. These are the people who are going to help you make sense of what you've found. So if your given working group or cell or whatever within Delta Green does not have that subject matter expertise in it, interviewing people who do that for a living, provided they can be trusted, may help provide that much needed context to really just take that investigation to the next level.
We can move on to a subject matter that I think often takes up the majority of the investigation, which is the investigative techniques to find clues. This includes things like surveillance and monitoring. How do we approach this? How do we do this efficiently?
Oh man, yeah. So again, not going to get into how these things are done legally, because that's like a college level course in itself, right? Like the warrant and the subpoena requirements and all that other stuff to get some of this done legally. We're talking your federal agents who have these resources at your disposal, but you're employing them in an unethical, illegal manner. So keep that in mind, right? When it comes to surveillance, right? It's really just you're following somebody. You've got a team, your working group. In my Delta Green, no one's giving you backup. You are the backup. You are it. But you're going to run surveillance. You're going to follow an individual and see and develop what we call a pattern of life. What do they do day in and day out? What does their average routine look like? And then what are the abnormalities in that routine? What are they doing that raises attention or suspicion? Or are they taking you to a scene of a crime? Or are they taking you to a place where they've stored evidence? One of a few places that they're going to go back to. They're going to go back to their intimate partner. They're going to go back to mom. They're going to go back to where their guns and drugs are. And so, typically those are good ways to find where somebody may have stashed something or left something. But then you've got monitoring devices, right? Fucking Apple is making it so goddamn easy. Just get an Apple tag and adhere it to the bottom of somebody's car who's not trained in counter surveillance or surveillance detection, and watch. That's all you got to do. That's your surveillance operation.
Yeah, it's easier now more than ever. I mean, modern Delta Green agents are going to have a lot easier time than the 90s or even the 80s,
Let me tell you, if you want to build tension, few things are as nerve-wracking as conducting surveillance, because you will literally start jumping at shadows, and like after I tell you 5 minutes, you're going to be convinced that they know you're there, they know you're watching them, even though you've done nothing to indicate, nothing to expose yourself. You are going to be convinced that you've burned yourself, and they now know where you are. You will play mind games with yourself more often than not.
Oh, that's a great perspective that I think handlers and players can use for sure. That's awesome. Obviously, like we discussed in our modern age, electronics are going to be a big factor. What are some examples of things that agents might use?
You can, as long as you've got a computer science guy, the world is your oyster. So, like, I honestly think, like, the two best characters you could have in any working group are going to be your people person with high human and persuade, maybe bureaucracy and criminology thrown in there for good measure, and your computer guy. Your computer guy is going to save your ass more often than not. When it comes to electronics, we're talking like ripping the contents of their phone, including shit that they thought they deleted. We're talking breaking into their house in the middle of the night, mirroring their hard drive, and then taking a look at everything that's on it. So if you're dealing with somebody who's posting unnatural tomes and copies to the internet, get access to their computer. These are ways to get access to that information, because now our whole lives are on electronics. Between the cell phone, between the computer at the house, laptops, smart devices. These are, even if they've got a home surveillance system, you could crack into that and essentially conduct surveillance without leaving your hotel room using the devices that they've installed.
What are some useful skills that might be needed in these investigations?
Yeah, bureaucracy, criminology, law, persuade, computer science, SIGINT, forensics, search, all of those are going to be like critical to this. Like, let's take the hard drive mirroring example. Maybe SIGINT to disable a security system, stealth to break in, craft locksmith or special skill lock picking to gain access, computer science to mirror the drive, you can use the previous stealth rating to assume that they get out, provided they were successful. And then, once you've gotten the data and you're looking at it, maybe, criminology to identify those patterns, computer science to determine network traffic, stuff like that.
So then we get to a point where sometimes investigations get to, which is that the clues run out or the well runs dry and we get stuck. We don't know how to proceed if we find ourselves in a cul-de-sac of some kind. How do the typical investigators in the real world find their way out of this situation?
You see this a lot with cold cases, right? Cold cases are really the closest real world analog you have to getting stuck in a TTRPG investigation. These are cases that have gone dead because we don't have the information to develop any further leads. When it comes to those, you just start at the beginning. You've started at the very beginning and you go through it again. And maybe there's a new technology or a new investigative technique that is now available that you didn't have previously that can help illuminate a lead that you didn't know existed at the time. Typically, the truth and the fact that you're looking for is there. You just haven't stumbled across it yet. And so really what you need to do as a player is go back to the beginning and just go through that list, look at what you haven't done, look at what questions you have unanswered, and then think about who can answer that question. Who can check that box for me? What can check that box for me? And go pursue that. And, sometimes maybe the handler won't have an answer and they need to come up with something on the fly and be like, that's a great point. Okay, we're going to improvise. And yes, this is something that we can use to address that.
Yeah, it's funny because we are talking about a situation where there is a beginning, middle, and end. The scenario has all the clues ready.
And I also love N times 5 as a mechanic for that, especially if you're given, you're dealing with a character who should know, who is like that skilled, experienced investigator in the group. Have them make that N times 5. And it's like, you know what? And sometimes that happens. You get tunnel vision. You get locked into a particular investigative path. And sometimes like you've got blinders on. And sometimes, you'll sit there and you'll be like, why didn't I think of this earlier? It's because that happens sometimes. We are like with witnesses, right? Even the investigators are fallible, and we are going to miss things. We are going to misconstrue, or what's the word I'm looking for? We are going to misinterpret things.
Seems like the golden rule works here, where if the agents are at least trying to be friendly and approachable with other agencies, they should be able to get the information they need. And same with the witnesses and the folks that they're investigating.
Kick them in the teeth with official blowback if they're not, though.
Right, exactly, yes.
Yep. Hell yeah.
Again, another reason why we love Delta Green is because so much of the game is when things fall apart, you got to pick up the pieces. So it's really helpful to know the basics of investigations, the structures that you're dealing with, the organizations that you have to interact with. So this has been very insightful and helpful. And I hope that not only handlers, but also players can get something out of this. Handlers, if you felt like this was useful, because I'm sure mostly handlers watch us, feel free to share this segment with your players. And when we eventually have this document created, we will be sure to update this video so that you can download it both here and on our Patreon.
Definitely. It'll be completely free since it does involve Delta Green mechanics, so it's going to be free to everybody. So just pop on by, download it, maybe consider joining. I don't know. Up to you.
Well, with us today for the scenario discussion portion of the show is Eric Priester.
Hey, Serge. How are you? Good to be here.
So Eric is the handler, the DM, the GM for his actual play podcast, Nature of My Game.
We do mostly horror games, so we've done the Yellow King RPG from Pelgrane Press. It's a gumshoe game. We've done some Delta Green, Night's Black Agents, Call of Cthulhu, Monster of the Week. And yeah, we're in the process of recording and getting ready to launch a full-on Delta Green campaign. Yeah, love Delta Green. It's probably my favorite game right now.
Well, that's why we have you on, because you reached out to us and you mentioned that you are running puppet shows and shadow plays, which, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the original scenarios created for Delta Green, and then it got a recent revamp for the Conspiracy Kickstarter. Am I right?
I think so. I think it was supposed to be Agent's first... an agent's first kind of introduction to the world of Delta Green. It's meant for just two agents, both in the FBI. So I think it probably, for a lot of people who started out early on in Delta Green, it was their first scenario they ran.
Well, maybe before we go too deep into talking about the scenario, I am curious about what was the initial inspiration on your end to run this particular scenario for the new season.
Yeah, I think part of it was that it was created as kind of an intro scenario. I'm also still going to use Last Things Last for the same campaign, which, obviously is the classic modern day intro scenario. But I was intrigued by the idea of just two agents. And, the new podcast is really going to be focused on one particular agent. So I love the idea of him and one other person encountering the Delta Green mythos for the first time, and kind of engaging with it in that way. I also wanted him to be a federal agent of some sort, and so it felt like this was as good of an opportunity as any to run this particular scenario.
Not until you mentioned it just now, but I realized it is a pretty good scenario for a very small group of folks, because as we'll get into, they get support from the local authorities and stuff. So it is kind of perfect for that. Yeah.
So Eric, if you wouldn't mind, just go ahead and give us a quick rundown of what puppet shows and shadow plays is all about, and how you've kind of adapted it for the campaign you're going to be running.
Sure. So I think it was originally designed. I know it was originally designed as an intro to a '90s campaign, and so it brings what's supposed to be two FBI agents onto a case of disappearances on the San Carlos Apache Reservation outside of Phoenix. Kind of as they go through and investigate the disappearances. So it gets connected to a string of murders that are happening across the United States. And of course, as they dig deeper, they find things that their characters, of course, weren't expecting, even if the players maybe were expecting, since they were playing Delta Green, of course.
Yeah, so you mentioned, one of the highlights or one of the aspects of the scenario is that you can choose whether they are initiated already or not. What did you go with, and what did your players actually choose for their agents in terms of their backgrounds and jobs?
So I wanted to set my campaign in the modern day, and so we started in 2022, and my two players were not members of Delta Green. One is an FBI agent, and she was recently transferred to the Phoenix office of the Phoenix FBI office. Didn't really get along with anybody in previous roles and has not been assigned a partner yet. And so the special agent in charge brings in a federal marshal who is better from the area, who's kind of better at managing some of the complex relationships with different local law enforcement, as her partner for this case. And so one player is the FBI agent, the other one is the marshal.
Some scenarios feel like if your agents do nothing, the scenario kind of solves itself. I think you maybe mentioned that this scenario can have those issues as well. Is this something that you took into consideration, and kind of what did you do to mitigate this?
I don't think I actually realized it until I was in the middle of running it, because it felt like the players were doing a lot of investigation. They were finding out a lot of information, and they didn't have any idea what was going on, which I think ended up being good and fine. And I think probably happens a lot in the scenarios where agents are not part of Delta Green. I almost compare it to something you might have in like a Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons game, where you have like an event-based scenario where like time keeps rolling on basically no matter what the characters decide to do, and it's really about how they handle those things that come at them rather than like moving from one clue to another, which I think is what a lot of DG scenarios are, is like moving from one clue to another, and this is a little different than that, I think. And this, I mean, I think this scenario really, there's so many good options for all sorts of different play styles, right? Like there are so many things that you can highlight or kind of move into the background depending on what you think your players will enjoy, the pace of the story, all sorts of things like that. You know, you have opportunity for major combat in the Manhunt. You have plenty of opportunity for investigation. You have opportunity for social interaction if you want to really play up the interaction between the state police and the tribal police and the agents themselves and the locals and all of those things. So
we're going to start getting into a little bit more of the spoiler stuff. So if you at home have not read or played the game, now is the time to walk away if you didn't already in the beginning. But, you know, eventually the agents are going to come to learn that the main antagonist is some kind of unnatural being that the scenario calls the Dischorder. I'm curious as to, you know, kind of how far into the investigation did the players go before they finally realized it was an alien that was, you know, kind of the main antagonist.
Yeah, they didn't actually, and you know, one of the things that I always promise my players is like, just play it like your character would play it, and I promise you, I'll tell you all the things you want to know as characters after the scenario. But they definitely realized something unnatural was going on, and I kind of brought the program in to kind of put a hard end to the scenario. So they didn't actually learn the kind of final puzzle piece at the very end of the story.
Yeah, it sounds like you were doing that kind of stylistically because it was such a small, contained story. There's no need for them to know everything. And I can see in this scenario why that would work, because the Dischorder is extremely hard to see. It rarely ever shows up. It lives in people's bodies. There's a million reasons why you would never see it if you were a particularly crafty handler. Yes. I think it's almost hard to bring it out unless you really want to do it intentionally, because it has so many defenses and so many ways of trying to kind of wriggle its way out of trouble that it's kind of its last attempt at saving itself is leaving the body.
The scenario overall definitely gives a lot of flexibility to handlers to either, you know, speed up or slow down the pace by feeding, specific clues at particular moments. So how did you incorporate that in your own run through?
The first time, this is a bit of an aside, but the first time I ever read the Handler's Guide and read through Sentinels of Twilight, I was so like almost blown away by the section at the end that talked about, here are ways to speed up the action if it's dragging, and here are ways to slow down the action if you feel like it's going too fast. And so I've kind of like incorporated that into every game that I run now because I love that idea so much. And it you know, that's more for running games on podcasts, I suppose, than it is for running a home game, because in a home game you might let your players linger on clues for as long as they wanted to. But I love the idea that there are these like levers that you can pull as a handler to kind of shift the narrative in a particular way based on what you think needs to happen. And so I found myself in this one where I felt like I really had to speed things up. They were really digging into the investigation and finding interesting things, but they just didn't, there was no real way for them to find the answer. And there are kind of certain things that happen along the way, the finding of the Braverman's car, the finding of the sheep and the Begay family out at their property, the kind of connection with the sacred cave and going to that place, and then finding the fingerprints of finding Santana's fingerprints and identifying him and knowing that he's the one you have to go look for. I had kind of an initial plan in my head of like how long those things would be spaced apart, and had to kind of speed things up because it felt like I was just going to have days of investigation that wasn't going to lead them anywhere unless I sped things up.
One of the things I really like about the scenario is the fact that there is this interesting tension set up regardless of the unnatural elements, and that is that there is this natural tension between the federal authorities, the local law enforcement, and the tribal authorities. You know, the fact that this is happening on tribal land is an interesting wrinkle, and I think sometimes that's where the best scenarios play. When I ran Reverberations, I just felt like it was lacking that je ne sais quoi, and so that's why I set it in Detroit 1984 in a much more interesting time. So this thing has it in spades. How did you play that up, and how did you find dealing with those elements?
Yeah, I feel like I prepared all sorts of directions that could go based on how the two agents just came in. Like, what was the initial interaction, right? Because they basically get sent from the FBI office to tribal police headquarters, where they're supposed to learn everything about the case right then. And you have this like big personality from the state police, Major Garrett, and then the tribal police chief, Colorados, who I think is more willing to work, it says in the scenario at least, is more willing to work with the agents, though both of them make it clear that this isn't an FBI case and that they want jurisdiction. And both of my players, kind of right from the beginning, were very deferential to the tribal police chief. And so I made the decision in the moment to have him be very helpful to them. And so the three of them kind of were able to lock out the state police because he was a much more kind of demanding and also unpleasant person. And so they kind of teamed up with the tribal police chief, and I think that helped them a lot and was able to kind of allow me to throw in some of the beliefs that the scenario says that the Apache people have through him, rather than them having to go interact with a lot of other locals.
I'm curious, did your agents, did they ever end up finding or interacting with the Dischorder ship?
They found the ship, but they didn't figure anything out about the ship. That actually, that was the one thing that really played up the kind of jurisdictional drama between the police forces. I didn't want them to be able to spend too much time with it in the FBI labs, and having the ship in the Apache tribal police office is what causes the police office to be attacked, or the police department to be attacked, which is kind of an important part of the scenario, an important part of the story. And so I really played up the challenge for which police department was able to take over this rock that they find, which helped me get it back in the hands of the tribal police department so that it could then be attacked.
That was the one with the really disturbing imagery too, right? Where the cops are handcuffed and their faces are flayed off, and it's just
horrible.
Yeah,
horrible, and you absolutely have to have that scene in any telling of Puppet Shows and Shadow Plays. So like it had to be done.
Yes, it did.
Did the players get to the autopsy? I know that you mentioned they didn't really know what the hell was going on, but at the end of the scenario, there's described a kind of autopsy scene where the Dischorder can show up.
They did get to the autopsy scene, and Santana, the way I played it was he faked dead when they encountered him and arrested him. In the scenario, it describes that if he's able to play dead in that situation, then the kind of zombie version of Santana can come back to life. And so that's what happened in the autopsy room with the medical examiner and just the two agents. And he's so strong that even though they tried to apprehend him, he got away. That's when the program shows up and kind of takes control of the situation. And it's really more like a blue fly team rather than a team of agents. It's like six SUVs pull in, all with guns, and they take Santana into custody and take every bit of evidence with them.
It's worth mentioning for handlers that there are 2 completely different stat blocks for Santana, because he goes from a 17 strength to a 26 strength.
Yes.
So it's worth remembering that.
After he dies.
After he dies.
After he dies, yeah. So we've already kind of touched on a little bit, but are there any other key differences between, the way the scenario plays out on the page versus how you ended up running it?
I don't think there are any other big differences other than the change of timeline, and even that didn't feel like that big of a change. I had other small things like, there's a suggested timeline for when events happen, and I, like I said before, I kind of accelerated that timeline. But other than that, I think I stayed pretty true, at least, to the extent that any one playthrough can hit all of the things in a scenario.
I really love the Manhunt section of this scenario. There's so often in scenarios where everything is done in secrecy, and if there is any involvement with the local authorities, it's something that the handler has to make up, kind of understanding the situation. But the scenario calls for, at a certain point, the agents have all the power that they need to capture this person. How did you implement that, and how did it go?
I know so little about how law enforcement works. I was thinking about Control Group again, and it's, you play astronauts in Control Group, you play the military in Control Group, you play CDC doctors in Control Group. I don't know anything about any of those things, and so I think that's a challenge for me as I run Delta Green, and so I played up the things that I felt like I could most kind of genuinely describe for them. And so and also the 2 players I had also don't know anything about law enforcement or like how to organize a manhunt. And so I kind of shared all of the resources that they had available to them to kind of impress upon them this feeling of just a massive, massive manhunt. And we did the roles like they suggest, where you can do criminology or bureaucracy or a couple other things to try to figure out how successful you are, how long it takes you to find Santana. But other than that, the only real kind of scenes that we did, where we had one of them do a press conference talking about finding Santana, or kind of identifying Santana, and that they were going to go look for him, and then kind of fast forwarded to the chase scene where it's nighttime and they find him, and the 2 of them are the ones that are kind of in the lead of running him down. And so it turns into kind of like a 3-person, almost sniper combat. And so other than really highlighting just the huge amount of resources they had, we didn't do a lot of kind of strategizing in the manhunt.
The cap to all this, anything you do differently if you had a chance to run it again?
I think that I would probably bring in Majestic or the program a little more prominently in the manhunt. It was something I was kind of intending on doing, and then I was so focused on kind of making a good confrontation between the agents and Santana that I just that's what I was focused on, rather than bringing in the program into the manhunt. But I think the idea of this super powerful government organization or like conspiracy, because that's the direction the players were thinking things were going. It's like, it's this huge cover up. And so I think bringing in Black Hawk helicopters as part of that, even if they don't actually ever interact with them, would have made things a little better and a little more intense for them in that situation.
Nice, yeah. I think that's definitely an element that the 90s set games have that's vastly different from what we're seeing in the modern era, right? Where the war with Majestic was much hotter, I guess you could say, versus the Cold War that we're seeing between the program and the Outlaws. I mean, man, because when NRO Delta comes around, they don't worry about about not leaving a mess.
Totally.
It's a fine balance, too, because you want the players to have agency, you want the players to feel like they've accomplished something, and if the big badass program swoops in and steals all their thunder, that could be a little frustrating. It might be effective for the show, but you're also running a game for players, so it's a fine balance. I understand if handlers maybe often find themselves not involving the program, or if you play it in the conspiracy era, the Majestic, as much as maybe the scenario suggests, or as much as you'd like. There's a lot going on in the background.
There's a lot going on. And in this case, I want this player to be recruited by the program, so I didn't want it to be so adversarial that
Exactly.
That wouldn't make any sense.
Right. That all makes sense. So what is kind of your final verdict of this scenario? Is this something that you would recommend to only experienced handlers? Is this really a great scenario for everybody being a newcomer? How do you kind of rank this?
I love it as an intro scenario for new agents, especially if you have people who want to play federal agents. It would be hard. I think it would be hard to run it for people who were not federal agents. You can fudge that stuff, but I think having those roles really sets it up really nicely. And then in terms of experienced handlers versus new handlers, I think it's a scenario that helps you break away from what I think where a lot of people get their kind of DMing or GMing experience from, which is D&D or Pathfinder or something like that. The idea that everything that's written in the scenario is exactly as it has to be, and you shouldn't change it, right? The scenario is a set of tools for you to use as a handler, strings to pull on, and nothing is set in stone until you say it out loud. And even then, it may not be set in stone if you decide you want to go back on it. But I think it would be hard. I think it's a hard scenario to run if you're not open to that. But if you're trying to learn how to do that better, I think it's a great place to start.
I think folks listening, watching are going to be pumped to watch this. Well, where can they catch puppet shows and shadow plays by nature of my game?
We're in the process of launching a new story for the podcast, calling it Sandcastle Virtues, which is a line from a Jethro Tull song that I love. And it's really going to focus around one agent, Agent Cliff Strickland, the federal marshal who was in the puppet shows and shadow plays run through. As he gets recruited by the program and then learns some disturbing things about the program and decides to bring it down from the inside. And his goal is to learn as much as he can so that he can make sure that when the bomb goes off, it goes off and takes everything down with him. So that's the idea for the story. The idea for the podcast is a chance for me to bring in players from other podcasts or from other places as well to interact with Cliff. And so in this first season, in this prequel season, awesome. We actually have Sydney Emanuel from the Glass Cannon podcast who played the other agent, the FBI agent. She was amazing. And hopefully want to bring in people from all over the Delta Green community as part of this podcast as well. Yeah, so you can find us anywhere you get your podcast. Nature of My Game. We're gonna be releasing this on our main feed at least through the summer for at least this beginning portion of it. We are at NOMG Podcast on Instagram and Twitter and Blue Sky and Threads, or at natureofmygame.com.
That's awesome. Eric, thanks so much for coming on. We always want to try to support the community. You reached out to us talking about running a great campaign, and so we wanted to talk to you and see what it was all about. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, man.
Absolutely. It was an absolute honor to be here. I'm also on record that I think Doomed to Repeat is the best Delta Green podcast out there. So very excited to be able to chat with you.
That's awesome, Eric. Appreciate it so much. Thank you. Another month, another episode. This was very informative and fun. We hope that you guys liked that interview with Eric. We had a ball talking to him. So much good stuff, but that is it for the month. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, let us know what you want to talk about. That's really the what's driving this show forward. Even Rachel Ivey herself mentioned that there is a noticeable gap in the Delta Green content front after the Green Box kind of took their hiatus, where there's not enough discussing the game itself, the mechanics, the system, the setting. So let us know what you want us to talk about. We want to fill that gap for you. So tell us what you're interested in, what you want to hear, and Serge and I will talk about it, and we'll bring people on to discuss it with us.
100%.
But in the meantime, we've got to thank our operator level patrons: Advanced Wars, Sammy, Bimblewort, Cameron S, Jonathan M, Kirby's Double, Onk, OG Pan, Ren, and WTF again.
Yeah, thank you guys, and we will see you next time.
Be seeing you, folks.